So it's perhaps a bit out of character for me to do a reading of an Emily Dickinson poem. Perhaps less out of character than it might seem to do it in this manner with what's playing in the background, and to address the idea of this particular poem, which is, as it has been pointed out, oddly, a ballad, since it has almost nothing to do with ballad form or the context, the social context in which a ballad might be performed. But I'll begin with a sort of claim or suggestion that may be wildly unpopular. I don't know. But when I read this poem again, and when I heard a discourse concerning this poem, the thing that immediately stood out to me was that this is a poem about the hermeticism and mysteries of mystical experience. And I have long regarded Dickinson as a kind of mystic poet, and one who's interesting in that regard, because there's no there are certainly traditions, out of which she writes, and there are certainly references to a number of familiar books, and those books include the classical and biblical texts that would have been available to her. There are references to Shakespeare, but there are references to the Psalms. There are references to classical philosophy, and then there are references to the transcendental writings that would have been familiar to her from her own time, and reading this again, a number of ideas related to mysticism occurred to me, and I quickly grabbed this volume by Evelyn Underhill, and it's an interesting, if somewhat problematic in the narrow confines in which it's argued. But her case is that wish to make a broad comparative study of mysticism across cultures and religions, nevertheless has a significantly Christian-centric bias, and that bias gets in the way a lot. And the other problem I believe that exists with this volume is that the author speaks from an academic and scholarly perspective, but at least to my reading is clearly not a mystic herself. And when one reads for example the poetry of Rumi, who's historically and socially constructed as mystic, then there's an understanding that this is the sort of operative mode out of which his work is existing, and the metaphorical transformations that go on in the process of writing about divine immanence and divine manifestation and communion, right? The divine merging with the overwhelming totality of an entity that both embodies eternity and infinitude on the one hand, and yet is represented to consciousness as another consciousness, that is, as a thinking infinity and infinitude, and a thinking and thoughtful and even emotional eternity, right? And it seems to me that if we look at Dickinson and not just this, oddly balladic poem, but if we look at a lot of her work in light of this mysticism, some of the difficulty, it may not, disappear, or we could say, if it were, this image, these clouds of difficulty, may not dissolve into a blue sky, but certainly we may, find other figures in them than the figures that we've, previously, been looking at, and I suppose that this poem represents that idea for me in a number of different ways. So let me begin with mystical experience, and one of the things that Evelyn Underhill doesn't discuss. But in mystical communication, there's often a shifting back and forth between the position of the I and the thou, and this is an odd thing to describe to individuals who haven't had this experience. But communications with the divine are not like communications with an other, in which the stability of my speaking remains stable, and the you to whom I'm speaking toward remains stable, so that in a conversation with the divine, which could begin anywhere, it could begin with a cloud, as it does in the image of on the cover of this text, Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill, or it could begin with a ballad, or it could begin with a song, either that has lyrics or that doesn't, or it could begin with an angle of light, and whether that angle is slant or direct, or it could begin with the iridescence of a rainbow, or it could begin with the idea of whether a circuit is telling the truth or lying, or whether that circuit is or whether that word that follows circuit means where something resides, where something has been placed, how it is that, and or the paradox of being both, that success lies, that is found somewhere, but the circuit in which it is found is itself lying, that is not telling the truth. And so the paradox here, that relates to this paradox of the shifters of the I and the thou, and the way that communication occurs back and forth in in the experience of mystical union is in a certain way embodied in the paradoxes and the do I want to say aporias? Perhaps not, but the doubling and the circuitry and the dissolve and the slantedness of direct discursive communication or simple informative, right, access to this idea of truth. And sometimes we have the idea that truth is it's either so this is either a book or it's not, and I open it and you can see that it clearly is a book, but it could have been a false representation of a book, and when I opened it, you would not see text, you would not see words, right? And I could have made this up, and I could have fabricated this as an artifact, and not, and it might not in fact be what I'm representing it as, and all of those issues can be determined for the most part, but there are truths that lie beyond what can be expressed, and the encounter with the divine and the divine union is one of those truths. And so I began with this discussion of the I and the thou and the shifting in it. And I had suggested the way that each of these words, seems to operate, like success in the circuit. It lies here. You can find it here, but I'm already lying because you can't. And it shifts in a way. And these, so this pronomial, I and thou, and or you, if you prefer a different kind of relationship, and I'm referencing obviously the Martin Buber, but beyond that, other recognitions of this communication between the soul, right? You could say like the self, the I as soul, and the divine one, the whatever the name that might be, God, Creator, divine, infinitude, all the many in one, the unnameable, the name, right? Which is ironic because the name is that which cannot be named. And these paradoxes of divine union, are already always there as soon as one begins speaking. And I'm trying to get at that idea with the way that these communications work in terms of I and thou. But one could begin here. Is it the soul speaking to the divine? Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Asking the divine to speak to it, the soul, the self, or is it the divine telling the soul to speak of itself and tell all the truth, but tell it slant? Perhaps to those who have not been engaged in the conversation and seen the stages of the success of understanding. And that's all from this sort of personal, experiential, phenomenological mode of having, communications with the divine. And as those communications are narrated and story told in different instances of mystics and their experiences, right? Particularly, Hermetic mysticism and the experience of this unfolding of these relationships. But there are, in various traditions, or the Orphic mysteries, in various traditions of Hermetic knowledge, the Orphic mysteries and others, there are stages in which truth is revealed. And one is an initiate, to this type of truth, this type of gnosis, and telling it slant is perhaps almost like if one wishes to climb a mountain, one looks for looks for that slope that represents the gentlest angle up the mountain, not the face of Half Dome, which unfortunately has suffered a lot from being climbed in recent years. And what are the potential dangers of such a vertical climb? Well, death or madness, or madness and then death, or homelessness, or perhaps the loss of one's soul itself into the dark night, which is something that a poet very different from Emily Dickinson, but also a mystic, complained of, and I'm thinking of Antonin Artaud. And there are perhaps a few innocent souls like William Blake that have such resilience that that in one way or another they can pass through these gates, rather easily, and write about them using the symbols, right? Through which those understandings are revealed, and even even in Evelyn Underhill's discourse on mysticism, there's a chapter on symbols, and it's actually pretty good, but she doesn't talk enough about why they're there, and there are some discourses on the Persian Sufi poet Rumi that do a good job of this and talk about the way in which he utilizes these extended metaphors, particularly of romantic love, to talk about the relationship to the divine. But everything in Rumi, whether it's a pomegranate or a glass of wine or a carpet or a butterfly or a flute, a reed, that's been pulled from the bed in which it lies, and fashioned into a reed instrument of flute will sing the song of its separation from its dwelling, the dwelling from which it was taken from, this source and home, and that itself is a metaphor of our separation from the divine. And so no matter for a mystic, no matter what social content belongs to the poem, and to be honest, Dickinson doesn't really have a lot of social content, but the story is always both about that social content and about the eternal content, right? And the eternal leaving and returning, and the fact that there's a darkness in Emily Dickinson doesn't, in my mind, change the fact that she's a mystic, because again, there's a narrative in this volume, that talks about the dark night, and that narrative, and I think this, in a way, is like telling telling lies to a child. The Dark Night in Evelyn Underhill is described as a narrative, the same narrative that we see it often described as part of a journey, and even the metaphor of night as the journey. There's going to be a dawn, right? And it's something that you pass through, and then you get to this more comfortable part of the mystical journey later. Well, for many of us, that narrative isn't quite the truth. It's more that you develop a tolerance for that part of your experience of existence that belongs to the domain of the dark night, and it's always there. It's always already there, and it's always already part of the future. And what I'm saying now is probably a violation of both the spirit and the rule of mystical revelation, but I'm doing it nonetheless. So this is an act of lightning, I suppose, to be revealed. But all of the mystical terms are there, right? So truth as this idea of light, and it's never referenced entirely directly. So this is another thing that's going on here, right? So there's this there's first like the question, like who's talking? Is it the divine, or is it the soul, or does it move back and forth, which is what I would argue, right? And then there's this idea of truth as light, which is itself a metaphor, but then it's never even spoken of directly. There's no direct statement that the truth is light, but there are references to this symbol and metaphor throughout the poem, right? So first the truth, the first metaphor is the journey or direction or vector, right? Or displacement. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. So the displacement would be I get from where I am in my ignorance to the truth directly, via this shortest point between or shortest distance between 2 points. That's a displacement, and here the idea is tell it slant, or perhaps tell it as a ramble, or if you like my idea of the mountain that we climb, find a route, and so circuit and that idea of the mountain kind of makes sense, right? So we're talking perhaps about switchbacks, and but also completing this loop to the divine brings us back again, the circuit, right, brings us back again to the idea of there being a kind of union, right, with that. Light, though, is figured in these ways: too bright, and then for our infirm delight. Well, I don't know if she took these distinctions seriously or not, but as early as Edmund Burke, the philosopher of aesthetics, there's a distinction, right, between pleasure and delight, and it's the same. It's the same distinction that we have in today in behaviorist terms, positive and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement is you offer something pleasant, pleasure, and negative reinforcement is you take something unpleasant away, right? You remove a punishment. So delight is the removal of a punishment, and so again, that almost doesn't make sense if you if you take that understanding of the word delight and not just another synonym for pleasure or happiness, because infirm delight, what would that mean? An infirmity of the removal of something unpleasant, too bright for our infirm delight. Or perhaps imagine that something unpleasant has already been removed, and then adding it again in the too bright, revealing the light again is creating the whatever it is that is unpleasurable, and that no longer belongs to this expression of being rid of, right, that blinding. And And even in this idea of too bright is this kind of paradox. So we think of the darkness as something that can be in a sense removed, or the truth, that's already there, but we can't see because of the darkness. The darkness can be lit up, right, by light, this metaphor of truth. But here it's too much, right, as it would be in a mystical experience. The truth's superb surprise, as lightning to the child eased with explanation kind. So lightning again is the image of the too brightness, and lightning again is dangerous and certainly dazzling, but to many children and to my dogs, lightning is extraordinarily terrifying. It's sublime, right? And if it's sublime, and that image of the sublime, exists here as truth, the sublime truth, then it again relates to this idea of delight and the need to see that divine, truth at a distance, right? And the pleasure of the divine, and Burke is different from Kant here, but Burke argues that the pleasure of the sublime is that it occurs in the distance, in this proximity of safety. So it's the delight of not experiencing the danger and threat of that which is overwhelming, to us, and terrifying and frightening. The comparison with the child, of course, is obvious. One doesn't give the truth to a child about these types of things. One can safely warn the child not to perhaps grasp tall metal objects in a lightning storm, but the truth of divine experience and the truth of the dark night. And as I said, I've already feel like I've given too much away there. It's really the violation of a rule, right? That one doesn't tell that kind of truth to a child. And yet, I have. So I've been a bad mystic pedagogue in a sense in this reading. But again, dazzle gradually is another reference to the light, and then of course, blind, and one can be blinded in darkness as the dweller in Plato's cave. But one can also be, blinded by the light, as in it's a strange drawing, a strange extra-textual referent in, but as in the Bruce Springsteen song, right? Blinded by the light, and there are more than one reference to being blinded by the light. And it's certainly a very old biblical reference, and belongs probably much it's probably much older metaphor and symbol than we find in in the books of Moses, and in particular that passage in Exodus, in which Moses encounters the spirit of the divine on a mountain in the form of a burning bush, and he turns his head away because God cannot be the creator, cannot be looked at, and there's a very old tradition, a very old Judaic tradition and understanding of this that belongs to the stories that are told involving the throne of God, and even the angels cannot sit or be present before God, and blindness again is a mere metaphor for the intolerable presence of God. And I've used the expression before, the I don't think I've used the word intolerable, but but both the presence, again, paradox, both the presence and the absence of God are experienced by the mystic as a kind of let's just use the word intolerable. Both the intolerable presence and the intolerable absence of God belong to this experience of union and separation, right? But there are only certain angels, there are only certain divine creations that can sit or be present in this place or metaphor that's defined as the throne or the presence of God. These are referred to as the angels of the presence, and these angels of the presence, if one has an understanding of their relationship to the divine, presumably, also experience the divine in this way, that when these entities are not in the presence of God, they experience this absence as an intolerable pain, and the only way that they can return to this delight is by returning to the presence of the Creator. Or by encountering another angel of the presence. Whose existence and manifestation participates in characteristics that belong to the presence. And therefore, there is a delight when two angels of the presence encounter one another. Whether that is at the throne, or whether that is elsewhere in the realm of the absence that is experienced as pain and punishment. So understanding it, from that perspective, I think changes a bit the way that this poem can be read, and there's one other, and I've almost already designated it, but there's one other element that doesn't involve just the pedagogy of initiatory truth that lies in this mystical domain, but this compass of the overwhelming, right? And so, in many mystical narratives, there's a moment in which there's an initial experience of the total and infinite union with the Divine One, but it's overwhelming, and it lies beyond language and beyond communicability, and it's emotionally and cognitively and the word that I'm looking for. I'm looking for a word that describes the experiential content of fullness, and it belongs both to the domain of the physical and physical comfort and understanding as well. Therefore, it's emotional, cognitive, physical experience of plenitude, and this plenitude is not an apt word for it, because it's not a return to some feeling of plenitude, but it's a delight that, perhaps some there might be some analogy of the idea of romantic love experienced for the first time. One perhaps never realizing that one was in so much pain of aloneness until one discovered this soulmate, or this other one that one could fully appreciate the plenitude of existence in relationship to, and of course it exists again with what I was saying about the presence of the divine and being in the presence of the divine, but this experience that belongs to many mystical narratives is also something that can destroy you, because once it's gone, there's a desire to repeat it, and many mystics that spend years or decades attempting to have this experience of plenitude, and find themselves in this domain of separation and longing, and so that's also part of this experience, and part of the narrative or potentiality of a narrative that belongs to the experience, and one could easily imagine that this desire for return, to the plenitude of the awesome light of truth and all that it entails, this journey, right? That one can easily imagine that these are instructions from the divine on a seeking, not just a telling, but the return to it, in a way, is presented here at a slant angle. So to say even tell all the truth rather than look for the truth, is it self-slant? Because are we talking about a teacher, or are we talking about the soul onto itself and onto the divine one, the creator, right? And in that experience of awesome, sublime, plenitude that one might, wish to return to, that, too, that search is never passed through, like the dark night of the soul, to this bright day beyond, in which I just put on my sunglasses or whatever, and remain in the light. But it becomes the idea of separation from the divine one, just as the divine presence becomes part of the way that one experiences the world, right? So that one is always, still in the dark night, even though perhaps there's more than just that. And one is always, in this state of separation, even though there's more than just that too. But part of, in my experience of even thinking about such things, there are things that where we reach the truth that it can't be told, and I have all kinds of examples of this, and I can even produce one by thinking about something that is too difficult for me to talk about, and then you will hear in my voice a pause and an inability to go on. And if I push beyond that inability, then I will speak in a kind of glossolalia. And there are occasions in which I allow myself to speak in this idiolect of this language, or this glossolalia, because I wish to continue speaking, whether the speaking is decipherable from those listening or not. But the speaking will cease to be a speaking in English, and it will become a speaking in this language. And if I wish to avoid that occurrence, then I have to remain silent until I can get over the silence back into the English in which the telling can be told. And there are certain moments in which this is more or less likely to occur, and there are certain distances that I can keep from what I want to say, and whether one calls those truths or not. But these deep things, one could say these are things from the depths, and these things from the depths to be spoken of at all, one has to maintain a distance from them, and so in order to speak, one has to maintain the distance of the slant. And the success in the speaking of these things from the depths lies in the circuit, and to experience the delight of the removal of this inability to speak. To experience the delight of the inability to speak of these things from the depths that are perhaps both too dark and too bright to reveal in the ordinary languages within which we can be perceived. One finds a circuitous route up this hill, and the danger, of course, in speaking beyond the silence is you can be locked up, right? So for those who encounter this silence and who persist in speaking, and whether you call it a speaking in tongues or a speaking in an idiolect of the sacred, or whether you call it something else, or babble, be careful, where and whom you allow yourself to persist, beyond this silence into this kind of expression, because in our society, and I this is also experiential, you can be locked up for this, right? And don't tell your psychiatrist that you speak to God, because he or she or they will lock you away, right? And so this is again advice, for children, in playing with lightning. So I've given, both good and bad advice in this reading of this Emily Dickinson poem, right? And I've given both, kind explanation, and I've given uncompromisingly truthful lightning that no one wants to hear, and that will, so will be denied, right? But this reading isn't intended to dazzle, gradually, but to offer a different lens, perhaps, on what both light and darkness are, or to offer a lens on the way in which aspects of the way that Dickinson sees light and darkness may have been overlooked or ignored if you don't perceive her as a poet of mystical experience, and I'm certainly aware that that's an arguable premise, and not claiming that it has any absolute authority. But I do think that an understanding of it goes a long way in reevaluating, what some of these truths and slants and circuits, might mean, and what, certainly the idea of lightning, the lightning flash of the divine. Even in Buddhism, this idea of satori is often referred to as a lightning flash of enlightenment, right? So satori, and for the poets, that idea of satori is there in Basho's famous haiku of the frog leaping into the pond, and all this imagery and all these details and this form, right, like the strict form of the sonnet, and suddenly you have like this just like inexplicable incursion of the real, which is also a metaphor for mysticism and the sudden revelation of the truth that in some ways exceeds the expressive potentialities of language, and exceeds the form of the communication through which the representation of the experience is provided in, that is a haiku, but that there's a struggle, right, on the part of the form to reach the experience. And I think that's always going on in Dickinson. And I had done a work in which I had attempted to approach this idea of communicating that first experience of the divine communication, right, or the feeling of it, but not from the point of view of a philosophical or analytical interpretation, like either something like this or something like varieties of religious experience, the William James, right? But from the experiential point of view. So how does one in poetry place it there? And the series that I did that in, I called Mystical Atheism, and of course there's a paradox there, and I only have fragments of that text, but the struggle to bring the experience to language, right, is implicit and inherent in it. And as this tune closes out, I'll see if I can find a representation of that text. Again, this is a fragment, but in this instance, the idea of fragment is perhaps also significant to the discourse, because what remains after this revelation, interesting Freudian slip there, right? Interesting that I said revolution rather than revelation, in referring to this lightning flash of the revelation of this presence and this experience of this union with it. And that particular parapraxis, that particular substitution in this instance, I find interesting because it speaks a lot about the way that this particular kind of revelation of the truth is also a revolution of one's mind and one's understanding of oneself, and a revolution of one's existence within the material world and in the world of ideas. And so there's something seeking, right, in the unconscious, in Freud's understanding of what these parapraxes mean, and a desire to come to the surface, like what is hidden, right, and what is hidden is totally relevant in terms of this experience if one looks at it as a mysticism, because we're talking about things that are hidden from us for good reason, just as things are hidden from children for good reason. You see now, if I can, I'm trying to find what remains of this text, mystical atheism. Right. So some of it I've destroyed, and some of it remains. And as you'll see, part of what remains is a representation of this struggle to get it into language, and this is not a representation of the glossolalia, but rather a representation of, you could say, call it textualalia, if that's anything. I don't know what it is. And my experience of being in the midst of glossolalia is different, and I'll talk about the way and why it's different. Okay, so here's an anecdote that will make sense of how it's different. So when I found a dog, he's now my dog. He's somewhere in the house. His name is Fiver, and that's a reference to, of course, the character Fiver in the children's book, Watership Down, which is a great book. And if you haven't read it as a child, you should read it as an adult. But I found him on the road, and I thought that he was dead, and I had a shovel in the car, and I was going to bury him, but it turned out that this is some of the visual imagery from this book, and part of that imagery I destroyed as well, but part of it remains. This is all mystical atheism. And then, there are moments when it goes back to language. But the anecdote, involving Fiver is, I had found him, by the side of the road, and he'd been hit by a car, and I was worried that, if I moved him, that perhaps his back was broken, and I would kill him. So I had to go retrieve, something to move him, and I returned home, and I got cardboard and large, like packing box of cardboard, like what you would put your wardrobe in, right? and it was pretty sturdy, so doubled it up a few times, and then it was like a platform. And then he didn't like it because, you know, he was a wild dog and growled at me. It was like the first and last time that he ever growled at me. But I got him on this cardboard, you know, platform, and I brought him home, and he couldn't move. He was paralyzed because he'd been hit by this car, and he'd been laying on the side of the road for a couple of days, and, you know, and he was pretty, you know, emaciated, and he'd been eating dirt to survive, and it was cold. And he'd managed to survive because he had this good, you know, coat. And like I said, he was a feral dog, and ate dirt. And then, you know, for a long time afterward, you know, his bowels were wrong, but he couldn't stand, and he was paralyzed on one side, and he couldn't stand up, and he certainly couldn't walk or anything like that. We had to, you know, I had to reteach him, you know, how to do all of that. And then blah, 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 blah. But really the story is about, you know, this moment in which I first, you know, take him to the vet. And, you know, I'm trying to describe, you know, to the vet, you know, what I need from them, and, you know, who I have in the car, because I didn't bring him in. I was describing the situation. And I couldn't, and I was locked in this silence. And I could only speak in the glossolalia, and, you know, of course, you know, that makes people really uncomfortable, and you know, but nevertheless, you know, I was able to ask for, you know, a pen and pencil, you know, just by, like, you know, signifying with my hands and using indications, right, you know, indexes of what was available, and then I could write, you know, what had happened, and even though I couldn't speak, I could write it, and I could write, you know, who I wanted to see, which was this particular, you know, doctor who I believed, you know, could help him. And in fact, you know, he had 2 surgeries. He had a surgery on his back leg that, you know, they managed to save, and put a muscle joint in where the hip had been shattered. And then he had another operation in which, you know, his front leg on the left side, you know, had to be removed because it was irreparable. But, you know, and that was hard too. But the interesting thing was that even though, you know, it was really hard for me to accept the idea that I was unable to help him any more than I did, that once that front leg was removed, he actually learned how to walk pretty well with. He does this dancey kind of walk with his back leg. But my point being, in this experience in which, you know, I was stuck in the silence and could only speak, you know, through the glossolalia, is that I could still write, right? So this isn't what we're encountering here with this type of, you know, glossotextuality, or this idiotextual representation, but it's an attempt to represent the idea of belonging to this inexpressible, right? And so the fragmentation of the language here is a representational strategy where that fragmentation does exist. Again, these are all images that I no longer have. And then light, you know, figures, you know, significantly in the experience, because light is always part of the mystical experience, right? And I think that almost is a human universal of this type of variety of religious experience. And for me, it's not religious in any way, shape, or form, and hence the, you know, part of the title that belongs to that idea of atheism or whatever. But it is a spiritual experience, and it's not atheist in the strict sense. It's atheist only in the sense of if theism is a word that you use to understand a particular kind of you know, cultural relationship to the divine that belongs to an institution or a set of cultural parameters that, you know, have an inside and an outside. You know, you're either one of us or you're not, right? All of those kind of separations of societas, or, you know, that that belonging to a church sometimes is as much about who doesn't belong to it as who's on the inside, and it's atheist in that respect, in particular. But all of these textual fragmentations and whatever one wants to call them, are representational, and in that way different from that speech which emerges if one pushes within the silence to express that the glossolalia itself is not representational. It's simply what comes out. But this example, and I'm not claiming there's really any affinity between this particular work and the Emily Dickinson Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant, number 1263. But what I am claiming is that the process of constructing this work and representing it shares something with the way that Dickinson's concerns about getting at the truth at a slant angle, may be a kind of solution set to inexpressibility that belongs to this experience of, for whatever reason, what can't be told, compared to what can be told, or that part of the experiential domain that seems to be beyond or outside of the usual or common uses and forms available in ordinary language and ordinary speech. And in that sense, mystical representation, is a kind of meta poetry, I suppose, but meta not in the sense of referring to itself, but meta in the sense of the beyond, right? And the beyond in that way is also part of the hidden and the hermetic, and can only be expressed either with symbolic strategies or other strategies of defamiliarization, as the Russian constructivists like to use that expression, right? Defamiliarizing, because it refers to an experience which is so outside of the conventional and the quotidian and the ordinary and the familiar